The night the building burned, the city felt strangely indifferent, as if it had seen too many disasters to pause for one more. Streetlights flickered over wet asphalt, and the distant echo of sirens carried across empty intersections. Daniel Reeves had just poured himself stale station coffee when the alarm split the quiet open. He didn't flinch. Years in the fire service had trained his body to move before his mind even processed the call. Jacket, boots, helmet, gloves, the ritual of urgency. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the speaker. Residential structure fire, possible occupants trapped. Daniel climbed into the engine, his jaw set but calm, as red lights spilled across the dark streets. Some firefighters thrived on adrenaline. Daniel didn't. He treated every call as if it were a fragile equation where someone's entire life depended on his balance. When they arrived, the building looked less like a home and more like a furnace trying to escape its own walls. Flames crawled out of shattered windows, thick smoke swallowing the upper floors. Neighbors stood barefoot on the sidewalk, wrapped in blankets, their faces painted in orange light. A woman cried out that someone was still inside, a young woman on the third floor. Daniel didn't hesitate. He tightened his mask, grabbed the hose line, and disappeared into the heat. Inside, the world narrowed to darkness and sound. The roar of fire, the groan of weakening beams, the sharp hiss of water meeting flame. Heat pressed against him like a living force, testing every inch of resolve. He followed the layout by instinct, counting steps, marking doorways, trusting training that had been carved into him through repetition and scars. On the third floor, he found her collapsed near a window that refused to open. She was conscious but fading, coughing against smoke that clawed its way into her lungs. Her eyes met his, wide, terrified, and searching, and something in that gaze lingered longer than a moment should allow. "I've got you," he said, voice steady despite the chaos. She tried to stand, but her legs betrayed her. Daniel lifted her without ceremony, shielding her with his own body as they navigated the choking corridors. A beam fell behind them, sparks bursting like angry stars, and for a split second the exit route vanished. He adjusted, pivoted through an alternate path, and carried her through the doorway into cold night air. Paramedics rushed forward. Oxygen mask, quick checks, urgent hands guiding her onto a stretcher. Daniel stepped back, removing his helmet, sweat cooling on his skin. She reached for him weakly, fingers brushing his sleeve. "Thank you," she whispered, voice trembling but clear. He nodded once. Firefighters rarely lingered in gratitude. There was always another task, another risk. Yet as the ambulance doors closed, he caught himself watching it drive away longer than necessary. Days passed. Calls came and went. Fires were extinguished, reports filed, routine resumed. Daniel told himself he had already forgotten her face. But then a letter arrived at the station. Simple envelope, neat handwriting. Inside was a note. She introduced herself as Emily Carter. She wrote about smoke and fear, about waking up in a hospital bed and realizing she had almost disappeared from the world without saying goodbye to it. She thanked him again, but her words went beyond gratitude. She said being carried through flames had felt like being given a second existence. She asked if he might meet her for coffee someday, not as a rescuer, but as a stranger she wanted to know. Daniel read the letter twice before folding it carefully. Firefighters were trained to step back from emotional entanglement. Lives crossed briefly, then separated. Yet something about the way she described survival, not dramatic but honest, unsettled his usual boundaries. He met her 3 days later. Emily looked smaller outside the chaos of firelight. Soft brown hair tied loosely, eyes still shadowed by recent fear, and a quiet strength in the way she held herself. They spoke awkwardly at first, circling ordinary topics, weather, work, recovery. But conversation deepened, threading into memories, regrets, and the strange intimacy of knowing someone through their worst moment. She told him she had been trapped because she returned for something trivial, a box of old photographs. He admitted he once ran back into a burning garage to save a stray dog he'd never seen before. They laughed at their shared irrational loyalty to things others might dismiss. Weeks turned into months. Coffee became dinners. Dinners became long walks beneath city lights. Daniel discovered Emily had an unexpected boldness. She would drag him into art exhibits he didn't understand, convince him to try foods he couldn't pronounce, and challenge his habit of emotional distance. She didn't see him as a hero. She saw him as a man who needed reminding he was alive outside emergencies. And Daniel, in turn, noticed how she still startled at sudden noises, how smoke from a grill could freeze her mid-sentence, how vulnerability lingered beneath her humor. He never pushed her to talk about it. Instead, he stayed close, offering steadiness without intrusion. Their connection grew in quiet layers rather than dramatic declarations, yet beneath it tension brewed, the unspoken knowledge that his profession might one day place him beyond her reach again. That day came sooner than either expected. Another fire, another night, another call that sounded routine until it wasn't. A warehouse blaze, unstable structure, partial collapse reported. Daniel entered with his crew, navigating the labyrinth of heat and steel. But inside, something shifted. An explosion, sudden and violent. The blast knocked him off balance, disorienting his sense of direction. Outside, Emily's phone rang with news of the incident. She drove toward the scene without thinking, drawn by a fear she couldn't name. Watching from behind barricades, she realized how helpless it felt to stand where he once stood for her, waiting, uncertain, hoping. Daniel emerged eventually, injured but alive, escorted by colleagues. Emily pushed through the crowd, relief breaking across her face in raw honesty. And in that moment, something changed between them. Their bond stopped being about rescue or gratitude. It became mutual dependence. Two people bound not by one dramatic event, but by the choice to remain present despite risk. Yet neither of them realized the deeper complications ahead, secrets tied to the fire that nearly killed her, truths about the building that would surface unexpectedly, and decisions that would force them to question whether love born from survival could endure when tested by reality rather than disaster. And as autumn settled across the city, their lives moved forward unaware that the past they thought reduced to ashes had never fully burned away. He tried to pretend the memory of the explosion would fade the way most incidents did, dissolving into paperwork and routine, but it didn't. The ringing in his ears passed, the bruises healed, and the shallow cut along his shoulder closed into a pale scar. Yet something lingered. Not fear, but a sharper awareness that the balance he and Emily had built could collapse with one unpredictable shift of fate. Emily noticed it before he spoke of it. She watched how his gaze drifted when he thought she wasn't looking, how he lingered by windows after sunset, listening for distant sirens. One evening she reached across the dinner table, took his hand, and asked him to tell her what was happening inside his head. Daniel hesitated, weighing instinct against trust. He told her he didn't fear dying, not in the dramatic sense people imagined. He feared the unfinished moments, conversations cut short, promises left incomplete. He admitted that knowing she waited for him somewhere made each call heavier in ways he hadn't anticipated. Emily didn't offer comfort wrapped in cliches. She simply nodded and told him that love had always been a risk, even without flames or sirens. That caring for someone meant accepting uncertainty as part of the contract. Her calm acceptance unsettled him more than reassurance would have. Winter crept in quietly. Snow softened the city's edges, and for a time life felt almost ordinary. They spent evenings indoors, cooking together, arguing playfully over music choices, discovering small habits that felt intimate precisely because they were mundane. Daniel learned Emily hummed absent-mindedly when she read. Emily learned Daniel double-checked locks out of habit he barely recognized. Then the past resurfaced. It began with a phone call Emily received one afternoon while Daniel was on shift. A city investigator requested a meeting regarding the building fire she had survived. She assumed it was procedural, perhaps final documentation. Instead, she was shown photographs and reports suggesting the blaze had not been accidental. Traces of accelerant, irregular burn patterns, evidence pointing toward deliberate ignition. The revelation unsettled her in ways she hadn't expected. The fire that nearly ended her life had not been random misfortune. Someone had chosen it. She told Daniel that night. He listened without interrupting, expression unreadable. Arson investigations weren't unfamiliar territory to him, but this was different. Personal. He asked careful questions, gathering fragments of information, though he sensed she needed emotional steadiness more than analytical curiosity. Days later, she remembered something she had dismissed before. A man she had seen near the stairwell shortly before smoke filled the halls. A stranger whose presence had seemed out of place. The detail gave investigators a thread to follow. As weeks passed, the case wound deeper. Emily found herself revisiting memories she wanted buried. Daniel supported her, but tension grew between protective instinct and respect for her independence. She insisted on cooperating fully, attending interviews, reviewing records, confronting discomfort rather than retreating from it. One evening, after a particularly draining session, they walked through quiet streets dusted with frost. Emily stopped beneath a flickering lamp and admitted she feared uncovering truth more than ignorance. Daniel answered honestly. That clarity rarely brought peace, but it offered control. And control, he believed, was worth the cost. Their relationship shifted through the strain. There were arguments, not loud or cruel, but edged with frustration. Emily accused him once of trying to shield her from realities she was already facing. He countered that he couldn't switch off the instinct to protect her. Silence followed, heavy and reflective. Resolution came not through dramatic apology but gradual understanding. They learned to navigate each other's vulnerabilities with patience rather than force. Love, they discovered, wasn't proven through grand gestures, but through remaining present during uncomfortable growth. Spring approached when investigators finally uncovered a suspect. The building owner had orchestrated the fire for insurance fraud, assuming vacancy would ensure anonymity. Emily's presence inside had been an unforeseen variable. Arrest followed swiftly, but the closure felt complicated. Justice offered validation, yet could not erase the memory of suffocating smoke or fragile survival. Daniel expected relief to settle over her. Instead, Emily became contemplative, as though brushing against mortality had shifted her priorities. She began volunteering with community housing initiatives, helping families displaced by disasters. Her empathy transformed experience into purpose. Daniel admired her resolve, though he sometimes wondered if she pushed herself to avoid confronting lingering trauma. He kept the thought private, choosing trust over doubt. One warm evening months later, they drove beyond city limits, escaping noise and obligation. They sat on the hood of his truck, watching stars emerge gradually. Conversation drifted between trivial and profound, laughter blending with thoughtful pauses. Emily asked him what he would have done if he hadn't become a firefighter. He admitted he had never imagined alternatives, that the path had felt inevitable. She confessed she once planned a predictable career before realizing predictability wasn't synonymous with fulfillment. The night deepened. Silence stretched comfortably between them until Emily spoke again, voice softer. She said she sometimes wondered whether their meeting had been coincidence or convergence, whether lives occasionally collided exactly when they needed transformation. Daniel considered the question without rushing to answer. He said he believed meaning was created afterward, shaped by what people chose to build together. She smiled, leaning closer, and rested her head against his shoulder. Neither noticed how easily affection had matured into quiet certainty. Time continued its patient movement. Seasons shifted. Memories softened but never vanished. They faced new challenges. Daniel mentoring younger recruits, Emily expanding her work. And through it all, their connection endured, strengthened by shared vulnerability and chosen commitment. Years later, on an ordinary evening colored by sunset glow through apartment windows, Daniel reflected on how unpredictably their lives had intertwined. A single emergency call had altered his trajectory, replacing routine distance with profound attachment. He realized love had not erupted dramatically like the flames that introduced them. It had grown gradually, persistently, resilient, as something rooted deeply enough to survive storms. Emily joined him by the window, slipping her hand into his. They didn't speak. Words were unnecessary. Outside, the city moved with its endless rhythm. Sirens, laughter, footsteps, quiet heartbreaks, and beginnings unfolding simultaneously. Inside, they simply stood together. Two people shaped by fire, yet defined not by what almost destroyed them, but by what they had chosen to nurture afterward. And in that quiet shared stillness, Daniel understood something he had never learned in training or crisis. That sometimes the bravest act was not rushing into flames, but allowing yourself to remain open, vulnerable, and present in the fragile, luminous aftermath of survival. Their lives did not pause after that quiet evening by the window, and whatever sense of completion Daniel briefly felt dissolved into the steady unpredictability that had always defined his world. Love did not replace danger, and stability did not erase the possibility of loss. Instead, life stretched forward with its own momentum, inviting them into chapters neither of them could anticipate. The summer that followed carried an oppressive heat that seemed to settle into the city's bones. Fires came more frequently, overloaded wiring, careless grills, neglected buildings turning into hazards beneath the sun's relentless glare. Daniel worked longer shifts, and fatigue began carving subtle lines into his expression. Emily noticed the exhaustion long before he acknowledged it. She learned to read the way he dropped his keys on the counter, the silence that followed him into rooms, the heaviness behind his eyes. One night, after he returned late and wordless, she sat beside him on the couch and asked nothing. Instead, she simply placed a glass of water in his hand and rested close enough for him to feel he was not alone. Eventually he spoke. He told her about a rescue that hadn't ended well, about arriving seconds too late, about the quiet that lingered in the fire truck afterward when no one wanted to break the weight of shared disappointment. Emily listened without interrupting, without trying to repair the unfixable. When he finished, she told him that carrying grief alone would only let it grow heavier, and that he never had to perform strength for her. Her words did not remove the memory, but they softened its edges. In the months that followed, Emily's volunteer work evolved into something more structured. She began coordinating outreach programs, organizing resources for families displaced by emergencies. Her empathy, sharpened by experience, made her both effective and deeply invested. Daniel sometimes worried about how much she absorbed from others' pain, yet he admired her refusal to retreat into comfort. Their relationship deepened in ways neither had predicted. They argued more honestly, laughed more freely, and allowed imperfections to exist without fear of collapse. There were evenings filled with quiet contentment, and others charged with restless ambition as they discussed possibilities for the future. It was during one of those restless conversations that Emily suggested something unexpected. She wanted them to travel, not far or extravagantly, but enough to step outside the rhythms that defined them. Daniel hesitated at first, unused to planning beyond his work calendar. Yet curiosity overcame habit, and within weeks they found themselves driving along unfamiliar highways, windows open, music loud enough to drown out lingering obligations. The journey revealed sides of each other that routine had concealed. Daniel discovered Emily's spontaneous courage in navigating unknown places. Emily discovered Daniel's thoughtful observation, the way he noticed details others overlooked, the structural design of old bridges, the subtle changes in landscape that hinted at hidden stories. Shared exploration brought fresh intimacy, reminding them they were still learning one another. One evening, in a small coastal town where waves whispered against dark sand, they walked beneath a sky painted with fading light. Emily spoke of how surviving the fire had stripped away her illusions of permanence. She admitted that before that night she assumed life would unfold predictably, that plans equaled guarantees. Now she understood fragility as truth rather than anomaly. Daniel responded with equal honesty. He confessed he once believed emotional distance kept him effective, that detachment allowed clarity in crisis. Loving her had dismantled that belief, forcing him to confront vulnerability he could neither control nor suppress. Yet he wouldn't trade it for the certainty he once prized. They stood quietly afterward, listening to the ocean's rhythm, and something unspoken settled between them. A recognition that they were building something durable not because it resisted hardship, but because it adapted through it. Years passed not dramatically but meaningfully. Milestones accumulated, career advancements, relocations within the city, friendships formed and lost. They faced illness in extended family, financial uncertainty, and moments where exhaustion tempted withdrawal. Through it all, they learned to recalibrate together, treating partnership as an evolving practice rather than a fixed achievement. Then came the night that tested them more profoundly than any before. A call arrived during a violent autumn storm. Lightning fractured the sky, rain blurring visibility into chaos. Daniel's unit responded to reports of a multi-vehicle collision on a bridge slick with water. Conditions were treacherous, tension immediate. As operations unfolded, another emergency erupted nearby, a tanker truck fire spreading dangerously close to trapped motorists. Hours later, news reached Emily through fragmented updates. She waited through a silence that stretched unbearably long, memories of uncertainty returning with cruel familiarity. Fear whispered old doubts, conjuring images she struggled to dismiss. Yet she remained composed, trusting the resilience they had both cultivated. Daniel returned at dawn, clothes soaked, exhaustion etched deeply into his posture. He was safe, though shaken by the magnitude of the event. Emily embraced him without words, relief communicating everything language could not. In that embrace, they both recognized how profoundly their lives were intertwined, not through dependence, but through shared acceptance of uncertainty. Time softened the intensity of that night, as it did with others, yet its emotional imprint lingered. It led to conversations about longevity, about dreams deferred in favor of responsibility. Gradually, they began shaping intentions for the years ahead, considering mentorship roles, community projects, perhaps even creating a shared home that symbolized continuity rather than transition. Their bond matured beyond romance into something steadier, layered with mutual respect and enduring affection. Passion did not disappear. It transformed, manifesting through gestures both grand and subtle, handwritten notes left unexpectedly, long drives undertaken simply to talk, laughter erupting over memories only they fully understood. Eventually, on a quiet evening illuminated by familiar city lights, Daniel reflected again on the improbable intersection that had begun everything. He realized their story was not defined by rescue, danger, or even dramatic turning points. It was defined by persistence, by choosing connection repeatedly across years filled with change. Emily joined him, sensing contemplation without explanation. She intertwined her fingers with his, the gesture unchanged despite the passage of time. Together they watched life unfold beyond glass and distance, aware that challenges would continue, aware that certainty remained illusion. Yet in the shared warmth of that moment, neither sought guarantees. They understood something deeper, that love did not promise safety or permanence, but offered companionship through whatever unfolded next. And as the night settled gently around them, they faced the unknown not as survivors of a single event, but as partners who had learned to transform every uncertainty into another reason to remain side by side. Years continued shaping them, quietly and relentlessly, until familiarity became something almost sacred. They no longer measured their connection by milestones or dramatic memories, but by the effortless understanding that filled ordinary days. Yet life had a way of reminding them that stability was never permanent, only borrowed for a while. It began subtly, as most upheavals did. Daniel started noticing hesitation in his own body. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't weakness, but a fatigue that lingered longer after difficult calls. Recovery took more time. The physical cost of years spent running into danger accumulated invisibly, settling into muscles and joints with quiet insistence. He ignored it at first, treating discomfort as an expected companion. Emily, however, recognized the shift. One evening she confronted him gently, asking whether he had considered what the future demanded of him beyond endurance. He deflected, joking about stubborn resilience, but her concern stayed with him long after the conversation ended. Weeks later, during a demanding operation involving a factory fire, he felt a sharp strain while helping evacuate a worker through unstable debris. He completed the task, pushing through instinctively, but afterward the pain refused to fade. Medical evaluation confirmed what he already suspected, nothing catastrophic but a warning. Continued strain could lead to lasting damage. The possibility of stepping back from active duty unsettled him more than Flames ever had. His identity had been forged within urgency and action. To imagine himself removed from that intensity felt like surrendering purpose. Emily approached the moment carefully. She didn't frame it as loss but transition. She reminded him that courage wasn't limited to physical risk, and that guiding others could carry equal significance. Her perspective planted a seed, though acceptance required time. While Daniel wrestled with change, Emily encountered an unexpected crossroads of her own. Her work within community recovery programs gained recognition, leading to an offer to direct a larger regional initiative. The role promised impact and influence, but required relocation. The news hung between them like suspended breath. They spent nights discussing possibilities, neither wanting ambition to fracture what they had built. Daniel admitted he could request reassignment or early transition into training roles elsewhere. Emily feared asking him to alter his path because of her opportunity. Both grappled with protecting individual purpose while preserving partnership. Resolution did not arrive dramatically. It unfolded through patience, honesty, and shared willingness to adapt. Daniel chose to transition into instructing new recruits, channeling experience into mentorship. Emily accepted the leadership role, and together they moved toward unfamiliar terrain, not abandoning their past, but expanding its horizon. The new city greeted them with anonymity and potential. They rebuilt routines piece by piece, discovering favorite cafes, quiet parks, and rhythms unique to unfamiliar streets. Daniel thrived in mentorship, finding fulfillment in shaping resilience within younger firefighters. Emily immersed herself in broader outreach, her empathy now amplified by responsibility. One winter evening, after months of adjustment, they hosted a small gathering for colleagues and neighbors. Laughter filled their home, echoing warmth and belonging. Watching from the edge of the room, Daniel realized how far their journey had carried them from that burning building and fragile first encounter. Later that night, when silence returned, he told Emily that he once believed purpose was tied to singular defining moments. Now he understood it was woven through continuous choice, through building, supporting, loving, and evolving alongside someone willing to do the same. Emily smiled, reminding him that their story had never truly been about rescue. It had been about recognition, seeing possibility in each other when circumstances might have reduced them to strangers passing briefly through crisis. Years would continue unfolding beyond that reflection. Challenges would appear and fade, joy and grief alternating with unpredictable rhythm. They would grow older, softer in some ways, sharper in others. Memories would accumulate, not all dramatic, yet all meaningful. And somewhere deep within those passing years, the essence of their connection would remain unchanged. The memory of smoke and fear transformed into gratitude, the spark of chance encounter nurtured into enduring companionship. Long after urgency faded from their daily lives, Long after sirens became distant echoes rather than immediate summons, they would still carry the quiet certainty that their bond had been tested in extraordinary ways and strengthened through ordinary devotion. Because in the end, their love was not defined by the night flames brought them together, nor by the trials that followed, but by the countless calm moments they chose to remain, attentive, compassionate, and present, as life continued unfolding around them without promise or pause. Years passed with a gentle inevitability neither of them tried to resist. Their new routines settled into place, and the unfamiliar city slowly transformed into something that felt like home. Daniel found deep fulfillment in teaching, watching young recruits arrive uncertain and leave steadier, more prepared to face the realities he had once navigated alone. Emily expanded her outreach programs beyond what she had imagined possible, building networks that helped families recover not just materially, but emotionally. Life felt balanced, not perfect, but grounded. They spoke often about how rare that balance was, and how careful they had learned to be with it. Then came the winter that shifted everything again. A severe cold front swept across the region, bringing storms that crippled infrastructure and strained emergency services. Though Daniel no longer responded to frontline calls, his former station requested his support in coordinating training simulations and assisting with operational planning during the crisis. He accepted without hesitation, stepping temporarily back into the environment that had once defined him. Emily supported the decision, though the familiar unease returned quietly. She trusted his judgment, yet memories had never completely faded. Still, she understood that purpose was not something either of them could abandon when it was needed. One night, during the height of the storm, Daniel remained late at the station assisting with strategy adjustments. Reports came in of a residential complex fire caused by overloaded heating units. The situation escalated quickly. Evacuation complications, structural instability, limited access routes. Though his role was advisory, Daniel accompanied a crew to assess conditions directly. He reassured himself it was oversight, nothing more. But standing near the chaos again awakened instincts long embedded in muscle memory. When confusion broke out over missing occupants, hesitation among newer firefighters prompted him forward before he fully considered the consequences. He entered alongside them. Inside, smoke coiled through narrow hallways, heat distorting perception. He guided them calmly, locating two residents disoriented by panic and escorting them toward safety. The action felt familiar, controlled, focused, until a sudden collapse blocked their intended exit path. For a moment, the past and present merged into stark clarity. Daniel adjusted quickly, redirecting through secondary routes he recognized from structural patterns. The group emerged safely, but not without cost. Outside, exhaustion struck him harder than expected, his breathing uneven, his strength briefly faltering. Medical personnel insisted on evaluation. Nothing catastrophic, only strain compounded by years and circumstance, yet the message was unmistakable. Emily arrived after receiving fragmented updates, her composure intact until she saw him seated under harsh emergency lights. Relief flooded her expression, followed by quiet intensity. Later, after the crisis subsided and they returned home, conversation unfolded slowly. Neither blamed the other for fear or action. Instead, they acknowledged truths they had circled for years. That Daniel's instinct to help would never vanish entirely, and that Emily's concern would never fully quiet. Rather than framing these as conflicts, they accepted them as permanent elements of who they were. Weeks afterward, Daniel chose to formalize his transition away from operational involvement entirely, dedicating himself fully to mentorship and education. The decision wasn't born of defeat, but understanding. He realized influence could extend further through guidance than through personal risk. Emily respected the choice, seeing peace settle within him where restlessness had once lingered. Spring returned gradually, softening the city with warmth and light. On an ordinary afternoon, they walked through a park blooming with renewal. Children laughed nearby, wind stirred fresh leaves overhead, and the world seemed unconcerned with past hardship. They sat on a bench, watching sunlight filter through branches, and Daniel spoke quietly about how unpredictable beginnings often carried people toward destinations they could never chart in advance. He reflected on the night he had answered a routine call, unaware it would redefine his life. Emily smiled, her gaze steady and warm. She told him survival had once felt like an ending to her, an escape from something final, but meeting him transformed it into a beginning instead. Not because he saved her, but because they both chose to continue building from that moment forward. Silence followed, peaceful and unforced. As years continued layering memories upon them, their story did not crescendo into spectacle. There was no singular grand finale, no defining dramatic closure. Instead, their ending, if it could be called one, unfolded through continuity, shared breakfasts, evening walks, supporting each other through aging parents, shifting ambitions, unexpected joys and quiet losses. They aged not away from each other, but toward deeper understanding. And one evening, long after sirens had faded into distant echoes and responsibilities had softened into reflection, they stood again by a window watching city lights flicker below. Daniel took Emily's hand as naturally as breathing. He realized then that the truest measure of their journey wasn't survival or courage or sacrifice. It was persistence. The countless days they had chosen patience, empathy, and presence over retreat or indifference. Emily leaned close, sensing his thoughts without needing explanation. Together they watched the world continue moving, unpredictable as ever. And in that calm, shared stillness, they understood something simple yet profound. That love born in chaos could grow into something enduring not by resisting change, but by welcoming it, shaping it, and standing together through every uncertain horizon that followed. Their story had begun in fire, but it did not end there. It ended and continued in quiet light, steady companionship, and the enduring certainty that sometimes the most extraordinary journeys are defined not by how they start, but by how faithfully two people walk them side by side until the very last page.